What started as a routine late-night interview turned into television chaos when legendary actor Harrison Ford clashed with Stephen Colbert over Hollywood's treatment of aging stars, leading to an explosive confrontation that ended with security being called. The studio audience at The Late Show with Stephen Colbert settled into their seats last night, expecting another polished celebrity interview. Harrison Ford, promoting his latest project, walked onto the stage to thunderous applause, his trademark gruff charm immediately filling the room. What nobody anticipated was that within 30 minutes, this would become one of the most controversial moments in late-night television history. The interview began innocuously enough. Colbert, flashing his practiced smile, launched into his usual repertoire of prepared questions about Ford's upcoming film. The actor, now in his 80s, appeared relaxed in the guest chair, his weathered hands folded as he answered with his characteristic blend of dry humor and reluctant celebrity. "Grace, so Harrison, you're still doing action sequences at 81, Colbert said with a slight smirk. When do you think it's time to hang up the whip and let younger actors take over these physically demanding roles? The question seemed harmless on the surface, but Ford's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Those who knew the actor well would have recognized the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his jaw set just a fraction harder. Ford had been fielding variations of this question for years, and his patience was wearing thin. "I think that's up to me to decide, Stephen," Ford replied, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there moments before. "I'm still capable of doing my job, and I don't need anyone telling me when to retire." Colbert, perhaps sensing an opportunity for viral content, pressed further. "But surely there's a point where studios start looking for fresh faces, younger, energy. Hollywood has always been youth-obsessed, hasn't it?" The studio audience began to sense the tension building. Ford leaned forward slightly in his chair, his famous intensity now fully engaged. "Are you suggesting I'm too old to do what I've been doing successfully for 5 decades? "I'm just saying," Colbert continued with that calculated late-night host swagger. "Maybe it's time to pass the torch. Give the next generation a chance instead of clinging to roles that might be better suited for actors half your age." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Ford's co-stars and directors had always praised his professionalism, his ability to maintain composure under pressure. But something about Colbert's tone, the casual dismissiveness wrapped in mock concern, struck a nerve that had been building throughout years of similar subtle age discrimination in Hollywood. "Clinging?" Ford repeated, his voice dropping to that dangerous quiet tone that anyone who'd worked with him on intense dramatic scenes would recognize. "You think I'm clinging to my career?" Colbert, seemingly oblivious to the storm brewing across from him, doubled down. "Well, let's be honest, Harrison. How many more Indiana Jones movies can audiences really stomach? At some point, doesn't it become less about the art and more about refusing to accept that your time has passed?" The studio fell silent. Even the crew members behind the cameras could sense that something had fundamentally shifted in the dynamic between host and guest. Ford's publicist, watching from the wings, took a step closer to the stage, her instincts screaming that this was about to go very wrong. Ford stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the studio floor with an audible screech that echoed through the suddenly quiet space. "You know what, Stephen? I've been in this business since before you were born, and I've earned every role I've ever taken. I don't need some talk show host who's never created anything meaningful telling me when my time is up." The audience gasped audibly. This wasn't the playful celebrity banter they'd come to expect from late-night television. This was raw, unfiltered confrontation, and Colbert's smile finally began to falter as he realized he'd pushed too far. "Harrison, I think you're misunderstanding," Colbert began, but Ford cut him off with a sharp gesture. "No, I understand perfectly. You think you can sit behind that desk and make clever little jokes at my expense, question my relevance, my ability to do the job I've been doing longer than you've been alive. But here's what you don't understand, Stephen." Ford's voice was rising now, His famous intensity turned up to levels rarely seen outside his most dramatic film roles, and the confrontation was just beginning. Here's what you don't understand about respect, about legacy, about what it means to dedicate your entire life to a craft, Ford continued, his words cutting through the studio like a blade. You sit there making jokes about age, about relevance, but what have you actually contributed to cinema? What lasting impact have you made beyond cheap laughs and political commentary? Colbert's face flushed red, his carefully constructed television persona beginning to crack under the pressure. The control he usually maintained over his show was slipping away, and his audience could see it happening in real time. Look, Harrison, I think you're taking this a bit too personally. Personally? Ford's laugh was bitter, devoid of any humor. You just told a national television audience that I should retire, that I'm too old to do my job, that I'm clinging to a career I've built over 50 years. How exactly should I take that? The studio cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of the unfolding disaster. Colbert's producers were frantically signaling from behind the cameras, urging him to de-escalate, but their host seemed incapable of backing down. His ego, bruised by Ford's pointed questions about his own contributions to entertainment, demanded a response. I was making conversation, Harrison. It's what we do on talk shows. We ask questions that get people talking, Colbert shot back, his voice taking on a defensive edge that his regular viewers had never heard before. No, Stephen, what you do is attack people when they're vulnerable, when they're here to promote their work and can't fight back without looking like the bad guy, Ford replied, his voice steady but dangerous. You hide behind humor and claim it's just entertainment, but you're really just a bully with a television show. The accusation hit Colbert like a physical blow. Several audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly aware that they were witnessing something far more serious than typical late-night television drama. The carefully orchestrated world of celebrity interviews was crumbling before their eyes. That's completely unfair, Colbert protested, his composure finally beginning to crack completely. I've interviewed hundreds of celebrities, and none of them have ever called you out on your behavior, Ford interrupted. They smile, they play along with your games because they have movies to sell, and publicists breathing down their necks. But I'm 81 years old, Stephen. I don't have time for your particular brand of passive-aggressive entertainment. The veteran actor began pacing behind his chair, his famous intensity now fully unleashed. The studio audience sat in stunned silence, many pulling out their phones to record what was clearly becoming television history. Ford's publicist had moved closer to the stage, her face pale with worry about how this would affect her client's reputation. Colbert, desperate to regain control of his own show, made the fatal mistake of escalating further. You know what, Harrison? Maybe the problem isn't my questions. Maybe the problem is that you can't handle honest criticism about your career choices. Maybe you're so used to people treating you like Hollywood royalty that you've forgotten how to have a real conversation. The words struck Ford like a match to gasoline. His eyes narrowed to dangerous slits, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of frustration with Hollywood's treatment of aging actors. Honest criticism? You call sitting in that chair, making jokes about my age and my career, honest criticism? You want honest criticism, Stephen? Ford stepped closer to Colbert's desk, close enough that the host instinctively leaned back in his chair. The studio's security team, positioned at various points around the set, began moving closer to the stage, sensing that the situation was spiraling completely out of control. Here's some honest criticism for you, Ford continued, his voice growing more intense with each word. You've built your entire career on mocking others, on cheap shots disguised as comedy. You think you're some kind of intellectual comedian, but you're really just a glorified class clown who never grew up. At least when I was young and making mistakes, I was creating something people would remember. What will people remember about you in 20 years? The brutal assessment hung in the air like smoke. Colbert's face had gone from red to ashen, his usual quick wit completely abandoned in the face of Ford's relentless verbal assault. The host, who had interviewed presidents and celebrities with equal confidence, found himself speechless. For several excruciating seconds, the only sound in the studio was the hum of cameras and the shuffling of feet as crew members positioned themselves for whatever was about to happen next. Ford stood over Colbert's desk like a predator who had cornered his prey, his decades of experience in portraying intense characters now channeled into real-life confrontation. Colbert finally found his voice, but it came out cracked and defensive. "You can't talk to me like that on my own show, Harrison. This is my stage, my audience." "Your stage?" Ford's interruption was swift and merciless. "You think owning a stage gives you the right to humiliate your guests? You think that desk makes you untouchable?" He gestured broadly at the elaborate set around them. "This is all just window dressing, Stephen. Without the guests who come here to promote their work, you're just a man talking to himself in an empty room." The audience began murmuring among themselves, some clearly uncomfortable with the intensity of what they were witnessing, others riveted by the raw authenticity of the moment. This wasn't scripted television drama. This was two powerful personalities, engaged in genuine conflict, and the outcome was completely unpredictable. Colbert, his professional facade crumbling entirely, made another critical error in judgment. Standing up from behind his desk, he pointed an accusatory finger at Ford. "You know what your problem is, Harrison? You're a relic. You're from a different era of Hollywood, and you can't accept that the world has moved on without you. You're angry because you're irrelevant." The word irrelevant seemed to echo through the studio like a gunshot. Ford's expression transformed from controlled anger to something far more dangerous. The veteran actor had endured decades of subtle ageism in Hollywood, had watched younger actors take roles he could have played, had smiled politely through countless interviews where his age was treated as a liability rather than an asset. But being called irrelevant on national television by someone he viewed as fundamentally unworthy of the platform was the final straw. "Irrelevant?" Ford's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than his earlier shouting. "Let me tell you about relevance, Stephen. When you were still figuring out how to tell jokes in college, I was creating characters that people still quote 40 years later. When you were making political comedy for people who already agreed with you, I was in films that defined cinema for generations." Ford began moving around the desk, closing the distance between himself and Colbert, who instinctively backed away. The studio's head of security was now speaking urgently into his radio, clearly preparing for the possibility that physical intervention might become necessary. "You want to talk about relevance?" Ford continued, his voice gaining strength and conviction. "Indiana Jones is more relevant today than anything you've ever done or ever will do. Han Solo will be inspiring people long after your show is canceled and forgotten. I've contributed something lasting to human culture." "What have you contributed? Besides division and cheap shots?" Colbert, now backed against the wall of his own set, seemed to realize that he had awakened something he couldn't control. His usual arsenal of prepared comebacks and scripted responses was useless against Ford's genuine fury. The host, who had built his career on being unflappable, was visibly shaking. I'm a comedian, Harrison. I make people laugh." "That's what I do," Colbert stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," Ford replied with devastating certainty. "You make people laugh at other people. There's a difference. Real comedy brings joy, creates connection, helps people forget their troubles for a while. What you do is weaponize humor to tear people down, and you hide behind your audience's laughter to pretend it's harmless." The studio audience was now completely silent, many covering their mouths in shock at what they were witnessing. Several people in the front rows could be seen recording the confrontation on their phones, capturing every moment of Ford's systematic dismantling of Colbert's entire professional identity. Ford stepped even closer, now mere inches from the trembling host. You know what the saddest part is, Stephen? You actually had talent once. Before you became obsessed with politics and controversy, you had moments of genuine brilliance. But you traded that for easy applause and viral clips. You sold your soul. For ratings. Colbert's eyes were now visibly watery. Whether from anger, embarrassment, or genuine hurt was impossible to tell. The man who had made a career of making others uncomfortable was experiencing that discomfort firsthand, and he was completely unprepared for it. "Security!" Colbert suddenly shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Get him away from me! Get him off my stage!" The call for security was the final humiliation for a host who had built his reputation on being able to handle any guest, any situation, with wit and composure. Ford looked at Colbert with something approaching pity, his anger now mixed with genuine disappointment at how thoroughly the man had revealed his true character. "You're calling security on an 81-year-old man because I told you some uncomfortable truths?" Ford asked, his voice now calm but carrying an undertone of disgust. "This is how you handle conflict, Stephen? You attack people when you think they can't fight back, and then you hide behind your security team when someone actually stands up to you?" Two security guards approached the stage cautiously, clearly uncertain about how to handle the situation. These were professionals trained to deal with unruly audience members or genuine threats, not legendary actors engaged in verbal combat with their employer. The lead guard, a middle-aged man who had worked television security for over a decade, had never encountered anything quite like this. "Sir, we're going to need you to step back from Mr. Colbert," the guard said diplomatically, his tone respectful but firm. Ford turned to face the security team, and for a moment his famous smile returned. Not the charming movie star grin, but something colder and more knowing. "Of course, I wouldn't want to make Stephen any more uncomfortable than he already is. After all, it's clear he's not equipped to handle an honest conversation." The veteran actor straightened his jacket and looked directly into the main camera, addressing the television audience with the same authority he had commanded in decades of film performances. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've witnessed tonight is what happens when someone who has built their career on mocking others finally meets someone who won't play along with their games." Colbert, still pressed against the wall of his set, found his voice again, though it trembled with a mixture of anger and humiliation. "You came on my show, Harrison. You agreed to be here. If you didn't want to answer questions, you shouldn't have accepted the invitation." Ford's laugh was genuine this time, but it carried no warmth. "I came here to promote my work and have a professional conversation. You turned it into an attack on my age, my relevance, my right to continue doing what I love. The difference between us, Stephen, is that when someone attacks me, I defend myself. When you attack people, you expect them to just smile and take it for the sake of entertainment." The studio audience was captivated by this final exchange, many of them now openly recording the confrontation. They had come expecting typical late-night television banter, and instead witnessed what felt like a masterclass in standing up to bullies. Ford began walking toward the exit, but paused and turned back to face Colbert one final time. "You know what the real tragedy is here, Stephen? You had a chance to interview one of the last connections to Hollywood's golden age, to have a meaningful conversation about craft, about legacy, about what it means to dedicate your life to storytelling. Instead, you chose to make jokes about my age because you thought it would get you a viral moment for social media." The words hung in the air with devastating accuracy. Colbert, still flanked by security guards who seemed unsure of their role in this unprecedented situation, opened his mouth to respond but found he had nothing left to say. Ford had systematically dismantled not just his arguments, but his entire approach to hosting, his professional ethics, and his character. "I've worked with some of the greatest directors, writers, and actors of the past 50 years, Ford continued, his voice now carrying the weight of genuine sadness. "I've been part of stories that have brought families together, inspired young people to dream bigger, and created moments of pure joy for millions of people around the world. Tonight, you had the opportunity to be part of something meaningful, and you chose cruelty instead. With that, Harrison Ford walked off the stage. With the same quiet dignity he had brought to countless film roles, the studio fell into stunned silence as the legendary actor disappeared into the wings, leaving behind a host whose reputation lay in ruins and an audience that had witnessed the complete destruction of a carefully constructed television persona. Colbert remained frozen against the wall for several long moments, his face cycling through expressions of anger, embarrassment, and something that might have been genuine remorse. The security guards, no longer needed, stepped back awkwardly. The studio audience sat in complete silence, many still processing what they had just witnessed. Finally, Colbert walked slowly back to his desk, his movements mechanical and defeated. We'll be right back after these messages," he managed to say, his voice barely audible. The cameras cut away, but the damage was already done. Within hours, clips of the confrontation would be circulating across every social media platform, with overwhelming support for Ford's stance and widespread criticism of Colbert's behavior. The incident would spark national conversations about ageism in Hollywood, the responsibility of talk show hosts, and the difference between comedy and cruelty. For Harrison Ford, it would be remembered as one of his finest performances, not scripted but devastatingly real.